Thank you very much for including me in this program, in the conference, and making possible my participation, my remote participation. So I cannot travel, I don't have a passport, so I don't have the possibility, the legal possibility to leave German territory. That's why I can only contribute to the conference via this connection. So I thank you all again to... hello, I can also see the audience. Hi, hello. Yes. I will present today. My presentation is about EU-Turkey refugee deal, and it will be a critical assessment of this deal. And as you can see, the title of my presentation is EU-Turkey refugee deal. This is not a pipe. It refers to the drawing of René Magritte, a Belgian artist, and the title of this drawing is La trahison des images, and it's about the false perceptions of an image and the denial of the reality. So an object doesn't depend that much on its name, and therefore one can find another one that suits it better. So that I try to challenge that the EU-Turkey deal, refugee deal, is a solution because it's called as a solution to a so-called crisis, and then it's called that is a legal agreement. So I try to challenge those perceptions, and I try to propose you another view on the reality. So my aim is to initiate a critical discussion, and as you probably all know, the EU-Turkey refugee deal is agreed on 18th of March 2016 between European Union heads of state and the government of Turkey, and I am originally from Turkey. I will first briefly present the deal and talk about how the deal is implemented, because it's now more than 3 years that the deal is implemented. My contention is that the EU-Turkey deal works on the principle of non-respect for the rule of law. I will mention some manifestations of this dynamic against the rule of law and talk about the denial of the judicial review of the EU-Turkey deal by the Court of Justice of the European Union. And I will talk about the legal basis of the deal, because the deal is based on the assumption that Turkey, the rule the overthrown, is a safe country. So the EU-Turkey refugee deal, as you all know, was presented as a solution to a refugee crisis, and it was designed to reduce the number of the migrants. So it was the objective of the deal. So the objective of the deal was not respect of the rights of refugees. And Turkey, and it was agreed to put an end to a long summer of refugee crisis. If we just very briefly remember what was agreed with this deal, all new irregular migrants or asylum seekers whose application have been declared inadmissible crossing from Greek islands to Turkey will be returned to Turkey. For every Syrian being returned to Turkey from the Greek islands, another Syrian will be resettled. It's called one-to-one rule. And Turkey will take any necessary measures to prevent new sea and land routes for irregular migration from Turkey to EU. After 3 years of implementation, there are regular assessments of the European Commission of the implementation of the agreement. On the slide, you see the assessment for the third year of implementation. It's interesting, the language adopted in those reports and the priorities of the EU Commission. It demonstrates that the capacity of the non-respect of the migrants' human rights is openly exhibited as a success of the deal. So the deal is called as a game changer. This is the terminology of the Commission, European Commission, because the arrivals decreased and this is the success of the deal. And the resettlements, you can see that it's the steady pace. It's over 20,000 Syrian refugees resettled from Turkey, and 10 EU member states have not resettled any Syrian refugees. So you can see that concerning the resettlement objective, it's a big failure. And according to the Commission, it's for political reasons or due to their non-participation in Schengen. 10 EU member states are refusing to resettle any Syrian refugee. And as I just reminded you about the deal, that there is this rule of 1-to-1, so there are also returns to Turkey. The Commission is not very happy with the rate of these returns. It's very slow. And it's a bit more than 2,000 migrants returned. And despite the changes in the Greek law, because in order to enable faster returns and bigger numbers, the Commission forced Greece to change their migration legislation, but I don't have time to elaborate on that point. This is the way the Commission, European Commission, assess the implementation of the deal. And if we see the assessment of the NGOs working on migration, how they assess the implementation of the deal, in March 2019, after the third year of implementation, they also 25 NGOs, they released a report. And what they point out is that more than 10,000 people are still forced to live in inadequate reception and identification centers built for a maximum capacity of half this population. While the number of asylum applications across Europe has dropped over the last 3 years, since it's presented here as a game changer, the number of asylum applications filed in Greece has increased extraordinarily. In Lesbos alone, for instance, the number of asylum applications more than tripled since 2016. So there is a completely another assessment and another image of the implementation of the deal. The report, the regular report of the Commission is also underlying the voluntary returns, and according to the official numbers, since the beginning of 2016, around 15,000 migrants have returned voluntarily from both the Greek islands and mainland. But according to the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, is an umbrella organization of NGOs, this is the poor reception conditions who trigger the so-called voluntary returns. And the Turkish Directorate General for Migration Management has stated that 215,000 Syrians have opted for voluntary return. 215,000 Syrians. However, human rights organizations have documented cases of arbitrary detention and deportation of Syrians from different cities of Turkey. and the reports corroborate allegations of coercion into signing voluntary returns documents. And the pre-removal detention is a persisting problem in Turkey, and the judicial review of detention orders remains ineffective. So it's very suspicious. There are suspicions, and we don't know really whether those returns are really voluntarily. And we have all the reasons to have our suspicions about this subject. So I will talk about how this deal is working according to a mechanism that is completely against the rule of law, against the European rule of law. And I have to talk about the decision of the European Court of Justice of the EU, and it's a non-decision of a non-EU deal. It's again, ceci n'est pas une pipe. So it was, the deal is challenged before the Court of Justice of the European Union through the application of 3 asylum seekers staying in refugee camps in Greece, who risk to be returned to Turkey. The applicants challenged the legal nature of the EU-Turkey deal. We are calling this deal, as a legal scholar, I consider this as a deal, but it was only a press statement. So the applicants challenged the legal nature of this EU-Turkey statement, and they consider that EU-Turkey statement constitutes an agreement between the European Council and Turkey. And they claim that their rights are adversely affected because of this agreement, and they request the court to annul the deal. And the Court of Justice of the EU has to determine the deal's authorship. Was the statement or the deal a measure adopted by an EU institution? If the court answered yes to this question, it would have also been expected to test the compliance of this statement or the deal with human rights standards of the EU. But the Court of Justice of the EU ruled that the EU-Turkey statement is a non-EU agreement. In fact, it is a European agreement between EU member states and Turkey, which was made at the European Council's meeting held in March 2016. So the court decided that it lacks fiction to review the deal. If we accept the reasoning of the Union, we have to admit that EU-Turkey statement or deal constitutes a form of crisis-led policy making, and it falls outside and it challenges EU treaty framework. So as many other legal scholars, I think that the court adopts a strategy for rendering inapplicable the democratic checks and balances that are otherwise applicable to the EU international treaty making. Human rights are dispensable as regards to refugees and migrants. They are excluded, according to that decision, they are excluded from the scope of the European rule of law. EU-Turkey deal is also challenged before another European Court of Human Rights. The applicant is a Syrian asylum seeker who came to Greece from Turkey. So the court will investigate whether the conditions for the detention of the asylum seeker, the procedures for his access to asylum in Greece and his return to Turkey are compatible with Greece's responsibility under the European Convention on Human Rights. And the allegations is the breach with the prohibition of collective remedy, and the case is still pending before the European Court of Human Rights. So another point that I want to raise is the legal basis of the deal. The refugees and migrants are returned to Turkey thanks to the presumption that Turkey is considered as a safe country. The deal's legal basis is Turkey is a safe country, but it's not a pipe. I argue that Turkey. The deal has a very uncertain legal basis, and it's based on this assumption of Turkish basis. As a Turkish citizen, I am exiled in Germany, like many other thousands of Turkish citizens. So Turkey is even not a safe country. So the assumption that Turkey is a safe country for the non-citizens, it means that the EU member states consider that a country where the rule of law has been completely dismantled can offer legal security. It means that there is a new interpretation or definition of rule of law. And if we look more closely to the legal regime governing the state in Turkey, cannot be considered as a safe third country for refugees because Turkey does not apply the Geneva UN Refugee Convention to non-Europeans. Turkey has a geographical limitation to Geneva Convention, and the migrants returned according to the EU-Turkey deal cannot have refugee status and refugee protection in Turkey. They are covered under the so-called temporary protection regime in Turkey, and this temporary protection regime falls short of those stipulated in Geneva Convention. And normally it's an exceptional regime of temporary protection, suitable only for a limited time, has become the permanent legal regime since more than 8 years for Syrian refugees in Turkey. So I will talk a bit about the very recent events that affecting also Syrian refugees. As you probably know, in September 2019, Turkey announced a proposal for repatriation of Syrian refugees and a creation of a safe zone in northern Syria. And northern Syria was controlled by the Kurdish YPG militia. So here in the photo you see the Turkish President Erdogan's address at the UN General Assembly in September 24th. And with the map he is explaining the 32-kilometer deep and 480-kilometer long safe zone inside Syria that the refugees will be resettled from Turkey. And he added, if we can extend the depth of this safe zone to Raqqa and Dar ez-Zor line, we can increase the number of Syrians who would return from Turkey, Europe, and other parts of the world. So he's proposing that he will invade Syria, northern Syria, and then resettle the Syrians, return the Syrians who are actually living in Turkey in this yellow and in this the north part of the yellow zone. And he is asking if you give me the possibility to invade more, then I can even return the refugees in Europe to these parts of Syria. And as you know,
2 more minutes, if that's okay.
Okay. So you know that in October 2019, Turkey started a military operation in northern Syria. And human rights organizations are alarmed and warns that the safe zone can become a death trap, like Srebrenica in 1995. An Amnesty International report, it's released today, say that Syrians were illegally deported into war even before this starting the safe zone. So if I conclude, since I have, I think, only 1 minute, the deal, the EU-Turkey deal and the way it's implemented are in explicit breach with EU member states and Turkey's obligation under international refugee law and international human rights law. EU-Turkey deal that establishes a regime where Turkey's authoritarian, European illiberal and liberal sovereign practices converge and function with harmony against the rights of migrants and refugees. And this illegal deal is implemented with the approval of Turkey's and EU member states' citizens. EU-Turkey deal represented as a solution is not a solution. EU-Turkey deal is not a legal text but an illegal agreement. EU-Turkey deal that established this shameful regime should be ended. I think I'm out of time and I can conclude with this word. I thank you all for your patience. Greetings from Berlin.
The policy discourse in Syria's neighboring countries has shifted from one focused on reception to return. Amid an increasingly securitized policy climate, displaced Syrians in Turkey and Lebanon have seen their livelihoods and rights deteriorate. At the same time, several surveys show that though Syrians want to return, they do not currently perceive the Syrian context as conducive to return. In those surveys, they have expressed concerns over military conscription, lack of shelter, and the fear of reprisal under the Assad regime. In this presentation, I would like to focus on the case of Syrian refugee return in Lebanon, with the aim of providing broader insights into how refugee rights are negotiated in spaces of ambiguity and fragmentation. I analyze the context in which Lebanon's governing actors, namely government agencies, political parties, and representatives of local communities, have started pushing for a politics of refugee return since 2016. At the same time, I show how, despite a prevailing consensus that Syrian refugees ought to return, Lebanese actors have clashed on how this politics is to look like, turning it into a key site of contention. I argue that various actors have drawn on the politics of return as a balance of power game. More specifically, they have used it as a bargaining leverage for deriving geopolitical gains in the context of Syria's conflict and for acquiring popularity in Lebanon's divided politics. So my presentation will unpack the following questions. How have some of Lebanon's key governance actors cooperated and clashed on return? How have they capitalized on the politics of return to maximize their gains? And last, how have their fragmented agendas paradoxically served the authority of the state? I proceed as follows. First, I map the proliferation of key governance actors involved in the making of refugee return initiatives. Second, I explore their conflicting preferences over the politics of refugee return. Then, I'll turn to the motives underpinning their role in refugee return and show how these motives are rooted in more imaginaries and relationships of power. In addition to media analysis, my presentation relies on interviews with key Lebanese political parties. So Lebanese politics rests on a complex system of sectarian power sharing in which Christian and Muslim communities have divided political offices. As you might know, right now unprecedented protests are currently taking place with a view to dismantling the sectarian-based model of politics. So the small state of 4 million inhabitants has taken in more than 1 million Syrian refugees, though it's non-signatory to the Refugee Convention. Here, it's worth noting that Lebanon's refugee regime does not embody a unified or system-wide set of policies. Rather, it is the outcome of a fluid interplay between various formal and informal structures. Formally, Lebanon signed a memorandum of understanding with the UNHCR, allowing it to register refugees. In practice, however, politicians have framed refugees as a matter of geopolitics and have historically framed them as a threat to the demographic balance of power. So at the outset of the Syrian conflict, the Lebanese government adopted an open border policy. By 2015, it closed its borders. However, 8 years into Syria's conflict, the Lebanese government has started calling for the rash return of Syrian refugees, framing them as a very difficult burden. In this context, various state and non-state actors have put in place multiple initiatives for refugee return. So Lebanon's key governance actors may agree today that displaced Syrians should return. Still, they have proposed and implemented various return initiatives that it has almost become impossible to determine a site of focal decision-making. So to begin with, the Lebanese state has created an official channel for Syrians to apply for voluntary returns. This channel is coordinated by the General Security Offices. 17 registration centers allow Syrians to apply for return, pending that the Syrian government decides on their applications. In parallel, some political parties that are close to the Syrian regime have devised informal committees to incentivize return, registration, and process applications. For instance, drawing on its close connections with the Syrian regime, Hezbollah established last year a return program with contact centers and task forces. That same year, the Free Patriotic movement, At-Tayyar al-Hur, Lebanon's largest Christian party, established a committee to facilitate return to Syria's so-called safe areas. Key communal actors such as religious authorities have also played a major role in legitimizing those return initiatives. For example, Lebanon's Supreme Islamic Shia Council has framed the return of rights as a sacred right. The Maronite Christian Church called on the displaced to return home as they constitute a threat to Lebanon's identity. So in this context, civil society activists have criticized such initiatives on the basis that they violate norms of voluntary repatriation in safety and dignity. Some Lebanese ministries have also deplored the multitude of return initiatives, calling on the Council of Ministers to become the focal authority on return. Still, the Council has abstained from developing a policy frame, delegating instead return to Lebanon's security agencies. At the heart of this deadlock and fragmentation are key governance actors' conflicting preferences of what this politics of refugee return is to look like. As many of you know, Lebanon's relationship with the Syrian regime has been one of the most polarizing issues in Lebanon's post-war order. For more than a decade, Lebanon's governance actors have been divided into two major coalitions called the pro-Syrian and anti-Syrian coalitions. At the heart of this division is whether Lebanon is to coordinate closely with the Syrian regime on geopolitical matters or to distance itself from such a course. So according to my field research, pro-Assad and anti-Assad actors in Lebanon are particularly in disagreement over the following issues: Lebanon's relationship with the Syrian regime, the identity of actors Lebanon is set to coordinate with on the question of return, the conditions and temporalities underlying Syrian refugee return, and Lebanon's position towards international actors funding refugee stay in Lebanon. In a nutshell, parties aligned with the Syrian regime in Lebanon, such as the Shia party Hezbollah or the Christian party, the Free Patriotic Current, have called on the Lebanese government to normalize its ties with the Syrian regime to facilitate refugee returns. Some of my interviewees argued that although they are not refusing some externally sponsored refugee return initiatives such as the Russian initiative, they consider the Syrian regime to be the main authority that can provide security assurances for returning refugees. Such parties want to separate refugee return from the prerequisite of a political solution, drawing attention to the existence of regime-held safe areas. Generally speaking, they have called on the international community, namely the EU and the UNHCR, to stop investing money in refugee stay and to divert instead funds from Lebanon to Syria. Conversely, Lebanon's anti-Syrian parties, such as the Sunni-led party called the Future Current, have fiercely opposed the normalization of ties with the Syrian regime as long as a political solution was not in sight. Though they would like to see the refugees return, they have doubted the narrative that conditions in Syria are ripe for return. Moreover, they have aligned their stances with with the international communities or Western powers' position on return and have courted international powers seeking to provide refugee aid in Lebanon. So the question that arises is, what is at stake here? And what motives drive these competing preferences over refugee return? Why has Lebanon's Council of Ministers abstained from developing a policy frame, even though all key political executives have called for rash repatriation? And why have some political parties informally established return initiatives that have no legal anchor? I argue in my research that the file of refugee return cannot be separated from Lebanese actors' history of tensions with the Syrian regime and war imaginaries in the shadow of Syria's conflict. In such imaginary constructs, I show that the politics of Syrian refugee return has become closely tied to the imagined fate of post-conflict Syria, and how rival politicians may use refugee return as a strategic avenue to secure their interests, derive potential payoffs, and deploy authority. Very briefly, since 2011, Syria's war has provided Lebanese actors with a major opportunity to leverage not only its onset, but also its potential ending for their own interests. Pro-Syrian parties in Lebanon that rely on strategic and financial leverage facilitated by the Syrian regime have sided from the outset of Syria's war with the Assad regime. By 2016, as the Assad regime had regained control over most of Syria's territory, these parties have emerged as key domestic players on the ground, partly because of their steady alliance with the Bashar al-Assad regime. Conversely, parties that are aligned with the anti-Syrian alliance in Lebanon have capitalized on the onset of Syria's uprising as an opportunity for weakening the Assad regime and its allies in Lebanon and regionally. Yet, with the advances of the Syrian government forces, the anti-Syrian alliance emerged as a weak coalition, both domestically and regionally. Its leader, the Sunni Future movement that has supported Syria's opposition, has suffered significant losses of popularity. Within this climate, the refugee return file evolved into an opportunity that Lebanon's players could use to take power from each other. I will give some concrete examples before I close. First, Lebanese factions have used bargaining over the Syrian return issue as an avenue for forming favorable alliances and preemptively ensuring certain payoffs. So as I said, parties that side with the Syrian regime perceive coordination with the Syrian regime on refugee return as a twofold strategy. First, it would help them to consolidate their existing strategic alliances and expect rewards once a peace deal is secured in Syria. Second, it would allow them to rehabilitate the contested legitimacy of their staunch ally. By organizing returns, they promote the narrative of a stabilized Syria. In contrast, anti-Syrian factions that have suffered losses in the light of the Assad regime's victory draw on the file of refugee return as a bargaining space through which they may still offset some of these losses and, better yet, derive some future gains. For instance, by seeking to align their stances with Western powers such as the EU on the principle of safe and dignified return, anti-Syrian parties seek to compensate for their declining political leverage on the Lebanese scene. So the Sunni Future Current has shown unrelenting support for the EU strategy of refugee reception in Syria's neighboring countries. This strategy has enabled it to curate its international alliances, notwithstanding its declining power in Lebanon. Second, Lebanon's key governance actors have used the file of refugee return as a platform for cementing their sectarian power, especially in competitive electoral contexts. By calling for the return of Syrian refugees who are mostly Sunni, political parties and religious authorities have branded themselves as the gatekeepers of Lebanon's power-sharing balance between Christians and Muslims. Thirdly, some Lebanese governance actors who have emerged as triumphant domestic powers in the light of Assad's victory have drawn on refugee return to brand themselves as security managers and as mediators in times of crises. So, as perhaps many of you know, in 2017, following its victory over Islamist groups from Syria, Hezbollah negotiated on its own the return of more than 50 Syrian families without the Lebanese government's oversight. 1 year later, the party opened a return program in Lebanon, declaring its willingness to capitalize on its connections and power base within Lebanon and Syria to return refugees. By overseeing the flow of goods and people, Hezbollah certainly pursues a broader security agenda. At the same time, it casts itself as a problem solver that is ready to help until the Lebanese state solves the contentious matter of refugee return. How does this fragmentation and proliferation of return initiatives serve the Lebanese state authority? I argue in my research that informality and fragmentation bring benefits to the Lebanese refugee hosting state, in contrast to many works that portray the Lebanese state as weak and disengaged. Let me give you an example. By shifting governance away from central state institutions, such as the Parliament and the Council of Ministers, the state seeks to evade pressures to craft a refugee repatriation plan. As a result of fragmentation, international actors such as the UNHCR have found it hard to coordinate with one representative authority. At the same time, the Lebanese state has deliberately shied away from adopting an official position on return, outsourcing the task of refugee return to a variety of formal and informal actors obscures accountability. Here, it's not possible to assign blame to one institutional entity. I reach my concluding remarks. I looked at Lebanon's conflicting refugee return initiatives. I have also analyzed how these agendas are to be read in the context of complex relationships of power and competing war imaginaries in which contending domestic actors wrestle over tangible and symbolic gains. I have moreover attracted attention to how fragmentation over return politics has served the state's logic. I hope I have contributed here to the development of a broader case study that illustrates more broadly and more generally how responses to displacement on the ground are often shaped in spaces of liminality, informality, and ambiguity, and hybridity as well, at the expense of rights-based norms. Thank you so much.
So I entitled the paper Rights in Context, Exploring Faith-Based Humanitarianism Through the Lens of Refugee Hosting. Its simpler title might be taken from one of my interviewees in Turkey in a humanitarian organisation who said to me simply, "The future is political." Much of our work on refugee hosts has been concerned with themes and practices of protection and assistance, addressing questions of rights and rightlessness within the plural and complex context of refugee host, civil society, and national and international humanitarian response. In consciously moving away from state-centric and narrowly international humanitarian narratives and choosing to focus on communities of displacement and hosting, we have not, however, sought to lose the state as an actor. Rather, we have sought to understand the complex, mutual implication of state and non-state actors, refugees and hosts, in the construction of refugee realities. To express this more philosophically, we have not sought to conduct a programme of research that seeks to collapse or dissolve consideration of the properly political questions of rights into the softer space of the ethical. Never mind rights, let's just talk about hospitality. For better or for worse, we have sought to reread the mutual implication of the political and the ethical as it arises in the lives of a complex range of agents who shape the localised and, in this sense, also nationalised globalised experience of refugees. This might be articulated as an attempt at sustained, multifaceted attention to the question of rights in their socio-cultural, socio-legal and socio-religious context. I do not think it is unfair to say that such readings still remain fairly underdeveloped in much rights-based discourse, humanitarian and academic. Hannah Arendt's work figures the aporia, in other words, the pathlessness of the refugee, as evidence of both the negation of rights and their endless fragile reinstantiation, holding in critical relation the political in the ethical and the ethical in the political. In critically extending Arendt's work, and anybody who's Turkish, I can only apologise for my pronunciation, Ayten Gündoğdu argues, rightly I think, that rather than despairing in the face of the impossibility of rights work, we might, quote, take them, that is the perplexity of rights, as challenging political and ethical dilemmas that can be navigated differently, including in ways that bring to view new understandings of the relationship between rights, citizenship and humanity, end of quote. In this sense, to study rights is, inevitably and necessarily, to be interpreters of, quote, struggles to reinvent the meaning of rights. Arendt's work remained critical diagnostic in mode. She does not propose to us a new theory of normative rights, but rather she calls for critical attention to the aporia, the pathlessness of rightlessness, and its negotiation by agents in history. It is to the historical performance of the aporia, the pathlessness, that she demands critical attention. As Gündoğdu notes, quote, an Arendtian politics of human rights centres on the political agency of those subjects whose rights are at stake and who venture to vindicate these rights and declare new ones. Our work has, I think, in multiple genres, followed that critical diagnostic spirit. In this final sense, it adds, Bouchani and Lyndsey talked yesterday about his incredible No Friend But the Mountains. So it adds Bouchani's insights to Arendt's, that we can only know the condition of rights and rightlessness through a multi-perspectival analysis. In Arendt's work, refugees figure rupture as well as mere displacement. Nonetheless, we, political cultures, so who do I mean by we? Political cultures, including scholars of rights, find ourselves drawn less to the figuring and the significance of the rupture, which is carried into refugee experience, than to the question of matter perceived to be out of territorial place. I'm interested in that question of rupture insofar as refugees figure a rupturing, or they are the evidence of rupture of the original social contract, and they carry that rupture into contexts where a social contract rightly then has to be and should be ethically renegotiated by those who then come to belong to the territory. Where Gündoğdu talks of the need to look at, quote, the political struggles that introduce new understanding of rights, my contribution to the Refugee Hosts research project has been to listen to and critically reflect on the ways that local humanitarian actors, especially but not exclusively faith-based actors, have conceived of their role in fostering practices and an understanding of membership, the politics of membership, in response to rightlessness. In what follows, I wish to note that one of the striking things about conducting empirical research into local humanitarian responses is that listening to the interpretation and the experience of local actors takes the researcher back into figuring exactly this reality of rupture as part of and not separate from the ongoing apparatic structure of refugee rights and rightlessness. In 10 minutes now, I want to draw out 4 brief reflections on common themes from around 40 interviews with local and national humanitarian actors working in local communities in Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, and also some based in Geneva and London. These themes relate to the ways that these organisations reflected on the politics of membership as it relates to their work, The framing, the shared assumptions made by all interviewees was that a culture of rights was fragile, threatened, and in formal terms, narrowing or shrinking in all three contexts, albeit in different ways. A shared assumption was also that rights cultures are regenerated in multiple ways and require local place-based cultures to ground the refounding of rights. In different ways, the interviews also highlighted ways in which local actors seek to recognise a culture of rights beyond mere refugee supplication. I want to say just two things briefly about a note on the limitations of this analysis before somebody rightly points it out in questions. First of all, this is reflection and very early analysis of the interviews we've done with local and national humanitarian actors that have a presence in the local communities that we've been working in. It doesn't figure the perceptions of such actors by refugees and hosts themselves and ways that refugees engage these agents in agency with these local actors. Elena's work has talked about that in more detail. Kat, if she's here, I know her work does that as well. Nor does it deal in ways that relate to the previous presentation about the structural role of religious actors in the denial of rights. So none of this is meant to romanticise that. Rather, I've been working with civil and faith actors who are located in these local contexts, and I'm trying to read and honour what they have said in the interviews. So I'm claiming no more than an attempt to deal with what they said to me and figure that in a dialogue with some social theory. So, my first of two themes that structure the 4 points. Beyond an innocent account of localisation, power and co-option. Local actors expressed their ambivalence about the localisation of aid agenda, as well as the shift from humanitarian to development agendas. Repeatedly, interviewees expressed the view that they felt caught in a complex relationship with both state actors and international humanitarian actors. On the one hand, interviewees were clear that they experienced the turn towards localisation as simultaneously sometimes enabling of their contributions. There is a greater recognition of the role of the local, including faith-based agents in building effective and durable relationships with both refugee host communities, including relationships that facilitate recognition of and access to rights. But local actors also express concern about a lack of recognition of the role of power in the conception of and operation of the localisation agenda. Questions of religious specificity often boiled down, as I was mentioning in the previous session, to rather less exceptional concerns about unacknowledged operation of power, decision-making, and co-option. So they were more about the operation of power, decision-making, co-option. Responses suggest that there is a circulating problem of power inequalities in local contexts of displacement, and the localisation agenda can feed into those and intensify them. Refugees, hosts, and local organisations experience this in different and overlapping ways. 2. Vis-a-vis state actors, local actors talked of the Janus phase of the localisation agenda, woven through with a shift towards political narratives of integration, social cohesion, and harmonisation. These are seen as non-innocent narratives that bear complex relationships to the perception of local actors, that their own strengths lie in place-based and partnership models of working, that figure relationships over time in localities rather than simply the colonisation of spaces. In one sense, many local actors already figure host-refugee relationality, but they are increasingly aware that their own version of motivations and practices that build such relations exist in a tensive relationship to state agendas and risk co-option into state narratives of rights, hospitality, belonging, unbelonging, and increasingly expulsion. 3. Local actors, especially but not only in Turkey, repeatedly express their belief that they are operating in a state-instigated shrinking humanitarian space. As such, they are negotiating the simultaneously constructed localisation and politicisation and securitisation of their work. These interviews mirrored, therefore, what might be judged to be global trends towards the increasing surveillance and control of local responses to refugees. Local actors were aware that this shrinking humanitarian space has critical importance, not only for questions of assistance, but also for how rights cultures are kept alive. The practices of trust, equality, and relationship building that many local and faith-based actors talk about as hallmarks of their work are at stake in this. Local actors noted that a shrinking humanitarian space not only denies direct refugee protection rights, but also host legal rights to offer hospitality and to cultivate rights. A shrinking humanitarian space tears at the very conditions upon which rights depend. In this context, local actors talk of their attempts to keep open the tight space of protection possibilities. Point 4, which is my final point, founding practices of political belonging. While state agendas drive at the question of territorial membership, when I asked a set of questions about the vision and value of organisations, a common pattern emerging across responses was an attempt to articulate the role of local faith actors in facilitating both ways that refugees and hosts might figure and configure the consequences of rupture in the experience of host and refugee host experience. Organisations talked of the way in which their work attempts to facilitate ways that refugees and hosts come to appear to each other. The way in which organisations described this was so resonant with Arendt's understanding of how we come to appear to each other and how a public is created. As public and personal beings, as truly and fully human, talking of ways to co-construct a fragile form of political community, how that might be built, albeit without the power of institutional guarantees. Organisations spoke frequently of the conscious attempt to generate political community, with a focus on creating spaces for participation and gift exchange, and in some instances, common spaces to act together. Overcoming animosity and suspicion inter and intra-community through common projects rather than a focus on individual and segregated needs was notable. Again, cutting against the sort of religion and vulnerability agenda. This cuts against the tendency to focus on identity markers and a politics of intra-refugee separation as part of a humanitarian-driven vulnerability narrative. Local actors talked of the value of local actors in generating trust, stability, and relationship, and the idea of a durable life, a life that can be imagined in time and not just space. So, my conclusion. These interviews raise again the question of how rights claims are kept alive at a communal cultural level, especially when they appear most fragile and unrealised. Many local actors feel that they exist in a tight space of what others have called a protection impasse, and feel the ambivalence of this and within their own action in this space. Faith-based actors are aware of the conflicted space and place of religion as inclusion and exclusion as material resource that can be put to use for and against rights regimes, as we were hearing. They are also clear, mirroring the sentiments of Simone Weil writing on the history of force, that hospitable practices are not in themselves justice, but rather stand as proxies for justice, absent but constantly represented. I would venture, based on these interviews and the growing literature on local, including faith-based responses, that the register of how we study rights is and must shift to include reflection on local communities of displacement, engaging the socio-cultural register of rights talk, and moving towards an immersive and co-productive task of knowing and unknowing rights and rightlessness. Such research is less about the reification of local acts and more about critical attention to the task of the practical, everyday negotiation of these various forms of power, action, and meaning that structure host and refugee rights talk and experience.
Who would like to start? We'll take 3 or 4 questions and then offer the opportunity for our panellists to respond. Everyone is so tired. We do have refreshments afterwards. So it's just 15 minutes. We can do it.
You can do a dialogue, Elaine.
I can do it. I'll talk to my... Yes. There, wonderful.
It's not a question, it's just a comment to what Zeynep was saying. Sorry. It's just a comment following up on Zeynep's presentation saying last 2 years from friends working at NGOs that obviously there were hundreds of people who were forced to sign the documents to repatriate to Syria, but they weren't able to publicize them out of fear. And finally, today we have, I just want to say, the Amnesty International published a report today on these forced deportation, and this is the first official publication by a sort of famous international NGO. So just wanted to let everyone know that the report has been published just as a proof that it's been happening for a long time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have Palladia? A question here. Thank you.
Hello. I have a question to Ms. Fakhoury.
Yes.
Where is she?
Yes, I'm here.
Behind head. Can you maybe say something about the effects of what you were saying? Like, so the politics are these different actors who are trying to basically use this claim to return, politics of refugee return. Are they successful in that? Like, are people actually listening? Is it working? Or because sometimes I have the feeling that, I mean, what is the dynamics basically between what people are presenting and how maybe other political actors are reacting, and also maybe the people, either Syrians or Lebanese in Lebanon, are reacting to that?
Yes. Would you like to collect questions, or
We'll
should I
take,
just ask?
if we could take two more, if we have two more in the room. Thank you. Giuliano, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder whether, if, as relevant as Margaret's pipe, the rabbit-duck illusion is also relevant when talking about rights. What I mean by that is that organisations that are advocating for rights often do so on the basis of their own experience and their own self-identity, and I think there's probably a need to interrogate the way they engage in sort of reflexive thinking. I say that because I think Anna made a very good point earlier about secularity and neutrality. And I think, and then there's another question here about how NGOs define themselves. Well, I think liberal humanitarianism has often used the idea of neutrality or claim to neutrality in a functional way, in a tactical way. But it also becomes embedded in a belief system.
Absolutely.
And it becomes embedded in a belief system in which, in fact, they call themselves NGOs, or we call ourselves NGOs, but really, not really non-governmental at all, thinking about our dependencies, political and economic. And really that's an escape to an imagined neutral space of civil society. At the same time, there's a point there about conceptions of one's own religiosity or non-religiosity, and I think if we're considering humanitarian ideas of history, they're at least as mystical in their teleologies as religious theories of history are. And in fact, not only does that serve as a basis for or an inspiration, but it also serves as justification. What I mean by that is I think humanitarians often justify their own existence and their own work on the basis of a sort of rationalist, secular and modern theodicy, which is that there's this progressivist idea, which is the long march of progress, but obviously there's some friction along the way and there's a bit of fallout, so we'll be the ones who deal with that. And I think that is a religious basis which ends up translating in a sort of neutral or neutralist belief system.
Thank you, Juliana. One more. Yes, Estela, thank you.
I have a question to Tamirace. In one of your slides, you were mentioning like the pro-Assad and anti-Assad coalitions vis-a-vis the politics of return and how that differs. But then you also mentioned like that both the Shiite and Maronite, Christian Maronite religious authorities are actually advocating for the return of the Syrians. So, like, small premise, absolutely, like, we know that not all of Maronites, like, are with the Kataib, like, with phalangists. or whatever. Like, of course, that is much more complicated. But I was wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit on that, maybe thinking of the Kataib, although they're not part of the present government. I was thinking of this sort of intersectional space, like between politics and religion, and wondering whether it's really still about anti-Assad or pro-Assad vis-a-vis the politics of return. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's wonderful questions, and we'll be able to ask more questions over refreshments. But I'm going to take this opportunity to just ask the question to the panel, including Zeynep, and I hope that you can hear me here as well. If you could also offer some reflections on the relationship between the theory and the practice of rights when it comes to thinking through the roles played by members of local communities in responses to displacement. So just tying it back to some of the themes that we've been exploring throughout the conference. What is it to think about rights through the framework of communities rather than individuals? How do we think that through, both from a theoretical and practical lens? So what is the relationship between the theory and the practice of rights when it comes to the roles played by local communities or community-based rights frameworks? So I will invite responses from Myra left to right. So we will start with Anna, and then we'll work our way to Zeynep. Thank you.
Just quickly to pick up on the observation here, I think that it's fascinating. I mean, what you're describing is basically the political theology of humanitarianism. It is extraordinary to my mind that actual political theologians, people who wear that badge professionally as I do, have not worked on humanitarianism. There is a new volume coming out very shortly, but it's mainly global south focused, which again I find, I mean, in one sense interesting, but in another sense bizarre, because I think precisely these are operating theodicies of modernity, and we need to understand their production in those terms, and they do have mystical kind of structures to them as well. So I think, absolutely, I completely agree with that. I think we should also overturn the fact, just as you're problematizing the role of NGOs in terms of they're not very non-governmental really in terms of where their funding comes from, etc. So you're raising the question of dependencies and codependencies in practice and the power of that. I've just come back from Hungary. I was in Budapest working with churches who, under the 2011 Act, are not allowed to call themselves churches, who are attempting to work in the transit zones, have been repelled, are working with street homeless, Roma, etc. And the problem for me is, and I know this is a controversial thing to say, that the Hungarian churches are captured by the capital of the state, by the money of the state. And that's a really complicated situation. So what looks like independence is not independence, they're no freer than an NGO is of those issues of codependency. So it plays all ways. And there are complex political theologies going on there in the Hungarian context that construe things in that way. Can I have 2 more minutes while you go this way to think about the question I haven't thought about?
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. Tamirace, thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for your questions. First, of course, I focused on political parties and leaders of communities in that regard, in order to show how the politics of refugee return has become embroiled in geopolitical interests. And one of my main aims is to show that any policy template on the politics of refugee return in Lebanon is not going to work unless actors are well aware in how return is overlapping with historical legacies, temporalities of violence, discontinuities of rivalries that are being configured and reconfigured right now. And as long as these policy templates remain disconnected from an understanding of conflict spirals and from fragmented actors' understandings of the politics of return, I do not believe that there is any normative response or any rights-based politics that is going to ensue. So this is why in my current research that I'm going to publish, I actually shed light on clashing geopolitical responses to return, and I show how it's very difficult to untangle them, and that it's very important to empirically understand them and trace them in order to, show where are the interlocking rivalries and why I predict, this politics of refugee return to evolve into a very polarizing cleavage in the 2-3 years to come in the region, especially when it comes to Lebanon. Of course, I mean, Lebanese communities are not so naive. They know that political actors and local actors, especially religious actors, do instrumentalize the politics of refugee return, and also refugees are well aware of that. And the biggest proof, are currently the protests that are unfolding in Lebanon, in which people are actually claiming to dismantle the sectarian-based model of politics, which thrives on political elites, leadership, and ignorance of people's agencies and citizens' agencies. Thank you, Estella, for your question. This is, of course, a fascinating question, and I didn't have time, but of course it's very important to look at the intersectarian, but also the intrasectarian schisms and divisions that happen, for instance, when it comes to the differences regarding the Phalangist or the Kata'ib and the Lebanese forces, and how at the same time Lebanese political parties' positions fluctuate with regards to their interests and shifting loyalties within the Syrian conflict. I would have loved to talk more about that. And of course, there is more than the binary of the anti-Assad and pro-Assad regime. For instance, what I wanted to show when I gave you the 3 examples at the end, showing that it's geopolitics, but it's also about how they position and they deploy their authority within Lebanon's territory, how they use fragmented governance in order to strengthen territorial sovereignty, but also, how they thrive to become security managers, for example, or how they would like to cast themselves as mediators in the context of a Lebanese state that is failing to provide solutions. And within this context, I use the theory of fragmented governance that I didn't have time to elaborate on here, but so this research is forthcoming soon, and I would love to share it with you.
Thank you. And Zeynep, if you'd like to offer any reflections, thank you.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do, thank you.
Yes, okay. So I hear the voice coming from the audience with it's slightly echoing, and I hope that I correctly understood the question. It was about the returns from Turkey and the documents that the refugees were kind of directly or indirectly forced to sign, and that the reporting of this phenomenon by NGOs, international NGOs working on that question. I think that was the question.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it was both a comment, but also drawing attention to the Amnesty International report. Absolutely, that's been published today. There was also
yes, that's it.
There was also the comment of. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, the Amnesty International report, it is released today. It was about the returns, and there were also interviews with people, and estimates that over the past few months, it's hundreds of returns from Turkey. The Turkish authorities claim that there is a total of 315,000 people who have left for Syria from Turkey, and all those returns. But the interviews collected by Amnesty that it's hardly many people. They are not very much aware of the documents they sign, or they don't have any other option. But I also want to remind you that it's the background of these returns and signing the documents. Already in July, last summer, Turkey announced. It was in August 2019. Turkey announced that the Syrian refugees who stay out of the cities, Turkish cities where they are registered, will be forced to return to their initial registration towns. And it was the Governorate of Istanbul that announced that they will, if they find people, they will check the identity cards, and if they find out that they are not registered in Istanbul, so they will be detained in removal centers. And on 27 August, the Istanbul governor informed that 16,000 persons have been detained in removal centers across Turkey, and almost 1/3 were unregistered Syrians. Under Turkish law, applicants and holders of international protection, as well as temporary protection beneficiaries, are required to have a residence in the province in which they were registered. And since I don't have time, I cannot very much give you details, but I also had made some fieldwork in Turkey before I left Turkey. There are huge registration problems in Turkey, so many Syrians are not registered. So already in summer started to implemented a big operation to check the identity cards and registration status of the Syrians and put them in a remove. Normally, the objective publicly announced was to remove, to move those people from Istanbul or other cities to the towns, Turkish towns, where they are registered.
Thank you so much, Zeynep.
But also presumed to sign voluntary return documents.
I'm sorry
to
Syria.
Interrupt,
Zeynep, but we're going to have to finish shortly. It's 6 o'clock here.
Okay, that's it. Okay.
Thank you so much, Zeynep, and thank you to all of our panellists. I will just turn to Anna to offer those closing remarks for this panel on bringing together the theory and practice of where the community fits in these debates. And then I will offer very brief closing remarks for the conference, and then we will have refreshments. And we will finish by about 6.
Okay, in that case, I will be brief and polemic. And will speak for myself as opposed to echoing anybody in my research as the disclaimer. I think that we're in a time of resistance where the rights framework is shrinking and so deeply threatened that the role of local communities has to be one of figuring rupture and living in rupture in all its senses. It has to be part of interruptive practices, because this is the only way that there will be a conduit to rights. And I think that I go with Simone Weil's sense that this is not, those interruptive practices are not the fullness of justice. We can't romanticise them in that sense, but they are at very least the proxy for rights. But what a desperate state of affairs that all we can do is live with the proxy of rights.
Please join me in thanking the panel.